I'm Markus Eisele. I'm actually coming from Germany. That explains my weird sounding last name. Working for Red Hat since almost 9 months now, and I actually started working in the industry more than 14 years ago, and mostly for a German-based ISV. We've been working for all kinds of big corporations, like automotive OEMs. Sure, Germans are into autos, right? So this is something that brought me in contact with large-scale systems, with extremely large-scale systems and enterprise-y requirements. And in my spare time, I've always been a Java EE fanboy, so always looking for the lightest and most standardized solutions. And the customers kept throwing all those 3-letter acronyms at me, like ESBs, we want whatever you name them from whatever vendors are out there. And looking at it today, with all the microservices hype, I thought it might be a good idea to just look into how would we do something like an ESB if we get a chance to completely renew it, the whole thing. And I'm actually winding a little bit back. This is one of my favorite quotes ever. It kind of perfectly captures what I think that our industry does sometimes. And if you look at the big architectures I've been mentioning based on Java EE projects, layouts, it's more like J2EE based. It's projects, those things run 5 to 10 years in production. They are just insanely large. What do? We have individual EF files, we have our module bundles of whatever size. We deploy that to application servers, and most likely those are sooner or later to be clustered or scaled in any way. It looks kind of scary, and for sure it is, because if you look at the technical implications, this is exactly what people talk about if they think about monolithic applications today, right? So it was just all stuffed into a single place. We've been sharing code, but it was more like dropping jar files from left to right. And my favorite jar file name is still the commons jar, which every project definitely needs millions of times, right? So another thing, I can tell you some war stories. I definitely promise to not mention names or customers, but I can definitely promise that it's going to be fun. So the big push to production was just before Christmas. And that was kind of a tradition in Germany. So the few weeks before, when everybody already was on Christmas vacation, then we started to push those new releases out. And I can't imagine how many hours got burned, which should have spent with a family. But this is definitely one of the main implications of those kind of applications. It had a single database scheme, which is also weird, especially if it grows over time. I'm pretty sure that you all have seen different kinds of users throughout the whole application and lifecycle and business processes. So you end up having millions of this, let's say, nearly equally tables, and people just keep patching new tables instead of altering the complete scheme because they are so afraid of breaking anything else. And they are really, really large. Back in the days when I had that job at the ISV, they usually called me when shit was about to hit the fan. And this is exactly that Christmas-like setting. And if you have a code base like that, you really need to know what to look at if you want to find something. Infrastructure was what I'd like to call heavyweight. So I'm not really speaking about heavyweight servers, but we all know that big corporations tend to run something from the big blue or big red or whatever. So I think the worst startup time I've ever seen for a J2EE application server in my whole life was roughly 15 minutes. And the reason for that, it was connecting to different security infrastructure components to get users and roles which got centralized for the whole organization. And it was spinning up EJBs over EJBs. and somebody left over some container managed persistence beans because we've all been so proud about those upgradability, right? So applications tend to use a whole stack of different technologies. And if we upgraded servers, we most likely didn't really migrate stuff, we just made it run in the new version. Thousands of test cases, that could have been a big plus, right? So at the end of the day, it turns out that those thousands of test cases are age old. And they most likely have been created during the initial sprints, so whenever the application initially launched. Over the years, let's say more than 5 years of development time, new people come on board, they have to implement new features, they really strongly believe that some test case is going to cover that shit. And they definitely don't implement a new one. So this is not a good way to navigate a code base if you have to look at it. There are also some more team and QA implications. So 20 plus members was usual in that kind of settings. Test cycles, what about user acceptance tests? Totally undefined. You can read for yourself. My favorite is that we barely had something like a business-driven design in those applications back in the days. And the common package is one good example for that. We tend to layer stuff in our applications. So we had a UI layer and we had some kind of business layer, but it wasn't really cut after business requirements. And the funny thing is that we actually tend to have people being responsible for the individual layers in that application. And it's fun to see how web developers actually try to talk to Java EE guys or J2E guys back in the days. And I have to admit, this is definitely something that is 5 to 10 years old. But even then, if you try to evolve those applications with changing requirements, which you still have, the new features tend to grow over time because the non-existent business design in that application forces you to implement bits and pieces all over the stack and all over the place. Cross-cutting concerns are definitely not implementable at all. And here's a good example. I've been on site with a customer who built kind of a BI system based on RCP, so Eclipse Rich Client, and they had a bunch of code, 8 million lines of code, I guess, in PL SQL, so in some kind of host and database systems, and they had an equal amount of code in that whole Java ecosystem. Different J2EE servers, the client itself. And seriously, I've been talking about a BI-like data warehousing application. And whenever they wanted to have a new report for a new department in that application, they just started to copy the stacks they had. And that was how the whole thing grew. Beside everything, the obvious, I mean, yeah, whatever happened, end of the day, they were never able to implement a new security requirement because they would have had to touch every single individual departmental report that they ever built into that application. And we decided to not do. Why did that happen? Good question. Some thoughts. Technical debt. Yes, of course. Nobody really watched after. I mean, architects are those guys sitting somewhere talking to management, right? So they never looked into the code base. They never encouraged people to upgrade things. They never encouraged people to make it better. They just want to make sure that everything gets done in time and budget, of course. Another thing that is my personal theory, without stepping on anybody's toes, but as a matter of fact, with growing and longer running projects, you tend to see that all the senior people got pulled out of those projects, right? So, and they actually are replaced with juniors. And it's more like one senior makes two juniors, right? So, and that's exactly the scaling math that most of the people do in those projects. It's been running for 5 years successful. There can't be a need for any senior at all anymore, right? And of course, developers tend to be lazy, and I've seen those guys. So this is another good reason for this mess that we see out there. What else? No education. Yeah, people tend to actually, at least when they when they are in their solid positions as a senior developer, there's no real career path for developers, right? So, I mean, if you're not a developer by heart and live for educating yourself and really work for what you love, then you definitely have the other side of people who actually don't educate themselves and just stick with what they know. And you end up having people still implementing CMP beans on Java EE servers. They still support it, so I mean, anyway, outdated, excuses over excuses and thoughts and thoughts and thoughts. That couldn't be the end, right? Where do we go from here? Did it got better? I think we did that. We decided to basically treat everything we built so far as kind of a legacy system. We can't evolve it without spending significant amounts of money, so we just put it somewhere in the basement, let it run, and put something, let's say, in between. And this in between is totally fancy because it has millions of adapters. We could just have those, let's say, 20 J2E applications that we know are running, but we really doesn't want to touch anymore, and rewire them. And the sum is bigger than the individual pieces, and we use standards, right? So this is most important. Instead of just using Corba, which is, yeah, freaking weird, we now use fancy web services. And what else do we have? It's kind of enterprisey, right? So if your corporation has a decent size, then you have to have an ESB. There's some IT department telling you that, I'm pretty sure, or even big blues and O's or whatever. And it's centralized. Finally, I don't have to watch 20 million projects for being on track and definitely holding on all my design patterns and requirements. I can actually control this at a central place. Okay, I have to pay a little bit of a license. That might be a really big license fee, but okay. Did that help at the end of the day? Probably not, right? So I think the question is, what did those things really do? The core thing is obviously routing. So we have kind of message exchange between the systems, and we're able to monitor it. And I should have stated web services here explicitly because that's what most of the systems were built with. And what else do we have? We had a good fair chance to tweak the outcome a little bit, right? So it was transformation, which put us in a position where we actually could decide if the outcome of service 1 was enough, if there is another service that does a little bit better, if we want to merge the outcomes of 2 calls. So there's been a lot of communication flow in those ESBs. And just another short war story. I've put my hand on many projects and many ESBs from different vendors. And one of my all-time favorites is a demo that I've seen on a conference. Might have been Big O, I guess, a user group conference somewhere. And one guy was actually implementing something and showcasing something with their ESB. And he ended up copying JavaScript into some kind of tasks in the JBuilder UI. And if I think that all this stuff has to be staged over different environments, and they support different languages, right? So it's no longer only Java, it's JavaScript, it's Groovy. They support all kinds of scripting languages to just make the ESB do what they want it to do. There's no longer conflict resolution. This is heavily putting logic in there because it's the easiest way to just click around in an IDE and put in some lines of code, right? Very rarely, they had some features around versioning of services combined with deployment controls. This is something that I've seen, but most of the vendors actually try to achieve it by versioning the complete models that they deploy to their ESB systems. So it's not versioning and deployment of the individual services that are used in the backend, but more like the complete ESB model. Martial use of redundant services. As I said, you could put in a lot of things. Event handling was another thing that came up recently. Transformation was funny XML to JSON because it was cool, and then we put it into another web service call which also had an XML payload. We had some queuing in there, some very rare security concepts which had to be supported by the backend systems. We could transfer and convert protocols to a certain extent. And what else? Quality of communication, quality of service is one of those buzzwords that at least sold 2 million licenses of ESBs, I guess. I think this is another big selling point for those systems. And if you've done it right, it was a good solution. Is that still something that you guys see out there? Raise your hands, who has an ESB in his projects? I mean, there must be a reason that you're sitting here. Okay, that's at least 15 or whatever, okay. Where are we today? Who recognizes that one? Any idea what that could be? This is my most favorite picture ever. It's told to be an overview about the Netflix infrastructure. So this is basically the microservices approach they are running. And that's exactly what they do. I mean, you can name it whatever you like, right? But Java EE as a monolithic approach, J2EE even earlier in the days, and rewiring everything with fancy centralized components didn't actually pay off. So what we're trying today is actually evolve those architectures and applications into something new. The idea behind that is straightforward and pretty simple. And yeah, after 14 years in the business, I'd say I have seen that at least 3 times on the different titles. So we've been doing it with modularization in the code base. We've been doing it with kind of business components in our applications. We've been trying to build SOA-like approaches with ESBs. And now we're doing all that again in a slightly different angle and try to reduce the impact of change, which is our business all about, right? So there's not a lot of magic in there. The magic, and this might be your homework from today, are exactly those 4 or 5 rows. How to get there, right? So there are some approaches that you could take to find the right granularity of those services. My all-time favorite is domain-driven design here, so you just have to dig into that. You can easily have a monolithic, equally application designed with microservices. That is not a big issue. But as I said, take that as your homework and just dig into it if you're interested at all. What I would like to do today is look into how could an ESB, I couldn't even come up with a good name for microservice bus, MSB? I don't know. Is that a good acronym? Let's see and look what microservices or those modern architectures that promise to be a little bit more maintainable and a little bit easier to develop actually require when it comes to ESBs. Monitor and control root, blah, 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 blah. We don't need that anymore, right? So this is exactly not what we want those new architectures to do. We want services to do one thing really well, and we don't want to have kind of a fancy glue layer in between. So I think the reason I painted this in red, obviously, is it's totally no longer necessary. We don't want to have a centralized point of control, so we could just easily skip that. There are some approaches, and this is intentionally left very, very tiny. First of all, I have another talk which touches on that. Unfortunately, not here, but my colleague Christian Posta, which I've seen walking in the room earlier, is also giving a good talk about microservices and approaches. So we have ways and first iterations of architecture approaches to build microservices that fulfill those requirements that we've earlier found in ESBs, right? So look at it, it's good. Resolve contentions between the services is another equal point, right? So we want dumb pipes. We actually don't want to solve anything in between. Services need to do this fully or not at all. So if we really have to negotiate something, if a backend call fails, if we need to fail over in any way, this is more a pattern approach called circuit breaker. You'll find it inside services. You'll find it eventually inside those new MSBs, or whatever we call them. But you can also use frameworks like Hystrix. That's what Netflix came up with. So I'd say it's another good thing to cross as a requirement for our MSBs. What we absolutely will need is some kind of deployment for services, deployment support, and versioning of services. So I think this is crucial. And API management is one of the key success factors in our industry if we're really going further into that direction of microservices, lightweight protocols, and let's say data formats. So everybody's talking about REST, but just think about MQ, AMQ, T, whatever. There are plenty of options, and we definitely need to have different versions. And instead of putting a version string into your control flow, it's probably easier to have a centralized API. Oops, I said it's centralized. Okay, we're not done thinking about it, right? That's probably the most honest answer, but we're pretty sure we need something like that. Deployment, there's a little bit more to the story. I mean, deployment of services is something that I'd like to see. Many discussions around Docker lately about those single one jar file services. How do we deploy them? Is that part of the MSB? I'm basically only touching on that part here because it was part of the functional requirements for the older ESBs. I think it could be a crucial part, but I don't necessarily need it. It might be something that we want to scale out and have an easier rollout process, and it might tie into versions. It works good. That also implies that we need some way of packaging. As I said, Docker and images and whatever we could do with that container approach today might be one way to go. You could also think about Maven projects. Let's say we just build a WAR file like we do today, and we just have a Maven target which says run microservice. Could also be part of it. It's still not standardized. There are some solutions, and I'm actually pointing you in some directions in a few minutes. Service discovery is something that I think is also very crucial. It's never been considered an initial part, an integral part of an ESB. There has always been kind of a service discovery component, mostly separated from the routing engine. I think this was a big mistake, and it didn't work well because it's not been integrated in the whole development process front up. If we could correct something with modern MSBs, this would be my wish, that we could somehow really easily, probably even type-driven, if it's REST-based, if it's MQ-based, if it's, yeah, I don't know. I could think of different ideas here, but we need something like that. Versions, we've been there. Monitoring, yeah. ESBs have been monitored quite a lot, mostly for performance issues. So we better keep that part. I'm not thinking about business activity monitoring here, but we definitely need to find microservices that are no longer used. This is my biggest fear. Looking at that initial Netflix picture, how the hell do the guys know which service isn't called anymore? How do they find out? I have no idea. Might be just me. Anybody? Christian? You don't know, right?
They don't. I mean, they don't.
They don't.
Need to. They don't care. They just keep bringing in more.
Thanks, great. Christian, you already have some, right? I get you more stickers. Governance, right? So, I mean, this is also part of it. Yeah, I think I could easily speak about any single point on that slide for at least half an hour, but try to not to. Martial use of redundant services. Martin Fowler makes it easy. He says, decentralized governance. We don't need this, and this is probably really the approach, like we just bring in more services and we don't care that much. I don't know what the CDO will say or the CFO at the end of the day when the whole infrastructure is running something and we can't really tell him how to really squeeze that 10% revenue out of IT services and operations year by year. I'm on the fence with that. I think something centralized isn't bad in the first place. So I just don't want to have everything centralized. I think there should be some kind of specialized controller approach to keep an eye about what's going on in our MSB. Hey, another green one. Commodity services. Yeah, absolutely. First of all, is something like a lightweight runtime. As I said, the single jar applications or, yeah, let's say OSGI based on Carav, firing up in 2 seconds, something like that. I've lately seen 50 Shades of Tommy E, so those guys also have a very, very lightweight way of firing up Tommy E. Wildfly is starting in milliseconds. That also might work, and you could easily expose REST endpoints from EJBs, JAX-errors, so Java EE isn't exactly the worst choice for microservices either, but we totally agree that there is not the one solution that we need at that lightweight starting engine. I still think it should be part of the MSB package in some way. Almost for one reason, because I want to monitor those services and they need to tie into that MSB in some way. This is something from my personal area of interest. Cross-service security always has been kind of a SAML, Hazel, whatever. We make something work and we have some very complex configurations. I think I'd love to see a security approach which goes cross-services, which is actually usable, maintainable, and easily implementable without having to deal with heavyweight infrastructures or hard to understand specifications. So if I could make a wish to those newly runtimes, this would be on my top 5 list, I guess. Transaction management, seriously? He's kidding, he doesn't know what he's talking about, right? So at the end of the day, I still believe from the bottom of my heart that serious business applications will always need transactions. I mean, we are not streaming movies. We are running software in hospitals. At the worst case, we are manufacturing cars. This is definitely not done without transactions, and whoever wants to try, good luck with that. Service scaling. Okay, don't need to talk about that, I guess. This is just really an integral part. I want to have an easy way to load balance, to distribute everything that I have, and it has to be there. And yes, it's a slightly different direction that I like MSBs to be. I like them to be a tool set or chain for DevOps. This is something that I strongly believe is a minimum requirement for whatever we think about microservices. If we don't have that culture in place, it might be harder. Deployment, we've been there, right? So what else do I have? Configuration, we talked about that a little bit. I might be able to show you something. Profiles and app packaging, service discovery, versions, monitoring, governance. Failure handling, we talked about circuit breaker or other patterns. It's basically the enterprise integration patterns, right? So this is something that we still might need. The question is on which level we are going to implement them. And my personal pitch is it's perfect if a service uses something like that internally, but we don't want our MSB to provide all that fancy features. Asynchronous versus synchronous calls. And cross-service logging is another favorite, right? So everybody does logging. Imagine we have chained services, let's say just 10, and try to find out which user actually broke the chain with what request, and track that thing down. Well, what are you going to do? You start putting some kind of user identifier in your interfaces, or I mean, something consistent which really can be tracked down over all services. We need to have something like that. And I believe it's not, it could be plug and play. At the very moment, if you want to do something like that, you basically use some tools out there, you implement something based on Solar or whatever. So you're just pushing all your log messages to a central storage. Again, central. Okay, there are some more points I think that I'm missing here, but anybody, something obviously that I'm missing? I mean, fire questions at will. I'm here for an hour just for you, which is my pleasure, by the way. Okay, it's time to give you a little bit of an idea about an approach here. And this is not a product pitch. It can't be, because as a developer advocate, I like to talk about open source and upstream projects. So whatever I'm guiding you to here today, as of today, is either in beta or not even there. And might come out soonish as a final or whatever, but bits and pieces that you could look at that solve individual parts of the puzzle. And they are all available to you right here, right now. You can go to GitHub and download sources, play around with that, build it, use the binaries. The pieces. Okay, back to the overview. What do we have here? I think what we have is some kind of load balancing mechanism, right? So we need some kind of an API gateway. That's a total natural choice to put also security into that layer, to me at least. Then we have different kinds of containers. We need to speed up all this by using caches for our services. That's my strong belief, having been hunting down performance issues in J2E and Java-based applications for too long. Caching is done right. Don't get me wrong. You definitely need to know what you're doing, but it's an integral part if we're going to chain microservices. And we need something that is orchestrating all that, right? So I just put a service registry on top, but I think Fabric 8 could be even a little bit more. The individual pieces. Undertow is actually the new web server for Wildfly. It's part of Wildfly, will be capable of doing load balancing in a very lightweight and easy way, beginning with Wildfly 9.0. The features are pretty well documented, and I did actually do kind of a developer interview with the one who is responsible for implementing that. So if you go to my blog.eisele.net, then you find some more about that. And it is easy as using Wildfly as a server to use Undertow as a web server. It could be standalone, it could also be part of Wildfly, so you're free to choose what you're doing. It's lightning fast, so you don't have to actually use an Apache HTTPD anymore and add some modules or whatever. Undertow actually contains a complete ported to Java ported solution for that proxying mechanisms. So this is a real great approach, and I'm looking forward to Wildfly 9 and see all that support. APIMan, just some screenshots for you, is definitely a central component in that case. And It looks a little bit like a service registry. Whoever of you had his hands on things like that, it's not an obvious, easy way to click your services through into production state, so in ready state, but it's a workable, and it's definitely a good first choice if you're looking at open source products and don't want to mess with license fees in the first place. API management, there are some serious alternatives if you are really looking into production scenarios. Red Hat just recently announced a partnership with 3Scale. They also do API management on just a sheer different level, right? APIMan is something for you to play with and get a good feeling about what I think those solutions should, at a minimum, provide. Fancy story is you could actually download a complete Wildfly pre-packaged with APIMan. You just have to download and start it. All you need is a JDK. And again, I point out to my blog if you want to have a quick walkthrough, because the documentation is comparably weak at the very point. Then you could get some references from there. The actual service containers is something that I'm personally on the fence with. I love Java EE for a living. Don't get me wrong. It's my complete history. I've been part of the expert group for E7, so I've been really keen in developing that further. And I still believe that Wildfly is a solid container to run microservices. And it might be the easiest way for us as Java EE developers to just take the first step into that direction. But there might be better alternatives. Also, there might be simpler approaches in the coming Java EE spec. Java EE 8 is in the making. They are tagging on clouds again. So my hope is that they come up with a very lightweight profile. Java EE would be so much better if we could just choose the pieces that we really need. So let's have a CDI, a little bit of JAX-RS, and have some, let's say, persistence like JPA. And that's all we need for a profile that runs microservices of a certain kind. So that might be something that is upcoming. InfiniSpan is just the perfect combination with Wildfly to use as a cache. But I know, and you all know, that there are other alternatives out there. And no, I'm not presenting any architectural or implementation ideas, how to do microservices on that technologies. If you want to have some good talks about that, Adam Bean, who is a German Java champion, he actually gives some live sessions from time to time and answers live audience questions, so you can just follow it on the web. And he tackles on microservices on Java EE particularly. So this is a big shout out to him and recommendation. He has some real good pointers. The centralized management thing is still missing, right? So, and this is where I think Fabric 8 fits really well in. This is exactly a combination of runtime container control, project documentation, and scaling, and has a bunch of other features that allow me to monitor things. Like I have a dashboard to look at the individual instances. I could use versions of applications inside Fabric. I could even drill down to individual camel routes in my applications and see how those camel routes perform and how many calls go through them. All this is, I mean, those are obviously few screenshots, which is the Red Hat product. But Fabric 8, as I said, is open source, so you could just get it, and there are Docker images available. Just play around with it. The Hot IO console that you're seeing here is based on AngularJS, and it's kind of self-detecting the features that the individual containers that you administrate in that whole thing, in the whole fabric, contain. So if you look at an AMQ broker, or if you look at a camel application, depending on what's in the applications, the whole console starts changing look and feel and features. So might be a little bit complex on the first sight, but it's definitely helpful. And I think it's a solid way of first microservice bus. Just a head up, Fabric 8 just recently got completely turned upside down. So we basically have version 1, which is out there and stable and buildable and works. And we have version 2, which starts to adopt all fancy buzzwords lately. So instead of having Maven as a developer tool to define those application profiles and run them in Carav or Java EE, they now are shifting over to use Docker as a container technology. So Fabric 8 is actually expanding, adopting a lot from Kubernetes and reaching out into an orchestration tool for all your Docker containers. But it just doesn't stop at the container level, because it still is able to look inside the containers and deliver all the features that Fuse as of today already has, like looking at camel routes or looking at the queues in your brokers and stuff like that. This is consistent with a recent switch of OpenShift v3, which is our online service. So if you really want to play around with that quickly, hassle-free, just sign up for openshiftonline.com, which is Red Hat's cloud solution. And there are cartridges prepackaged, ready for you to, in just one click, get it started. There are demos out there. I talked about DevOps is kind of a prerequisite to get all this doing, right? So I wouldn't actually expect a company that has 3 letters and builds automotives and cars is actually able to spin over to that microservices approach in just a second, right? So I think this is probably the biggest misfit at the very moment. We're all looking at our individual projects and looking at how to evolve those into modern technologies and look at all the fancy buzzwords that are out there. And I have to admit, I can't think about getting this into production with some bigger customers, like, let's say, insurances, who are not the most innovative companies at all, right? So keep that in mind. I'm not saying it isn't worth pushing, because I believe it will be a solid part of whatever application development styles we have to deal with in the future. I'm not going to leave you alone without pointing you at some challenges around. Distributed systems are hard. That did not change since invented. So you won't get rid of dependencies. You won't get rid of some kind of different versions that you use overall. You'll definitely tend to do some kind of over-architecting in first approaches, which is so easy. Funny thing, I just try to implement something like Netflix. At least it should look like it from an architectural style, and I try to use something like, we call it Ticket Monster, which is a demo application of Jboss. And I was thinking about just cutting it in pieces and just making a microservices thing out of it. It couldn't take long, right? I know what to do. I have all the tools at hand, so let's get started. And didn't went so well, and I was probably naive by just trying without looking into it any further. But I can totally rest assure you that over-architecting is probably one of the biggest risks in adopting those new ideas. What I really dislike about this approach, you just have so many moving parts. And especially if you look into what my colleague Arun Gupta was posting lately, he was doing kind of a Kickstarter series on how to use Docker and boot to Docker and Kubernetes. And there's a whole lot of technologies and new buzzwords that roll in from that world into a Java and Java EE developer's mind. It cracks me up sometimes. So the number of moving parts definitely increased drastically, right? Also, the fact that you really end up having services of the same kind being deployed to multiple instances is another thing that I, as a Java EE developer, had to wrap my head around, right? So we didn't have anything like we are tagging our REST services and we're using 20 instances and we're just trying to have something in front of it and call it a service and just access the service, and the service does everything just totally transparent, and this is so over my head for the first time I ever looked at it. Messaging, service, metadata. What I actually want you to take away today is this. To me, there is no single successor to what we know as ESBs as of today. The whole thing that was easily sellable for big corporations and big blues turned into many, many different kinds of pieces. And even if I showed you I think solid approach to play around with, there is just not one solution. And to me it looks like that the things are still evolving. So we have some solid solutions for individual problems, but the single-click download for the MSB is definitely not there yet. So it might be time to sit back and relax a little bit longer and wait what stuff comes up over the next couple of months. But it's also definitely worth to contribute and see how to evolve those developments happening right now in the community. And this is probably my call for action today for you. Whenever you get a chance to play around with one of the technologies I've been talking about today, you're free to provide your feedback, right? So all projects are open source. They have issue trackers, mailing lists, RSC channels. Nobody is going to be burned for asking questions. It's more the other way around. Those are very, very communicative and embracing communities. So just make your voice heard. And if you think something is really shitty what we're doing here, or what the community is doing, just raise your voice and start to discuss with us. A pointer, the virtual Jboss is something that we've been successfully running for a year already. So whenever you want to learn latest about Jboss technologies in general, it covers the complete middleware stack, I guess, and we have some speakers that barely make it to conferences because they are heads down in engineering work. So just keep an eye on that channel. We just recently had a talk about Cape Dwarf, which is the Google App Engine implementation on top of a Java EE server. So, and the guy who was doing it actually gave a talk and a nice introduction. We have some more fancy things like Android developer tooling, so it really covers the complete Jboss stack. And I want to let you know that we just yesterday launched registration for DevNation, so whenever you feel like coming to the wonderful city of Boston, there'll be a great schedule covering a lot of microservices and DevOps culture. Devnation.org is the website, so just give it a shot. We just announced a first couple of speakers, Nginx is in there, and some other interesting things. I think, yeah, I don't want to lie to you. Thank you. If you don't have any questions, that would be my solid hour plus, oh yeah, yes please, you want stickers.
You talked about everything that MSBs in terms of services that will be built in the future, because let's say I have an application that's not microservices, and the only way we get into this is to rewrite the whole application or possibly repeat them.
Okay, the question is, I've been talking about how to build microservices applications, and you want to migrate something existing legacy code base and evolve it into microservices, right?
No, is that the only option?
You mean if rewriting is the only option to migrate something like legacy-based application? I don't think so. We've been seeing a lot of agility lately in our projects overall, and I'm a big fan of evolving architectures. And I don't see a need by just cutting everything at once. So there's still kind of a level plan that you could use and build out the first service features in your existing legacy code base. and just evolve it step by step, which would be my only approach to do it, actually. But I mean, on the long term, end of the project, the result might be that you end up having services instead of a legacy application, yes. And I don't think that putting an ESB in front is a solution. But yeah, you can get one.
There's no incentive for somebody to go into MSB because something that's already working, what is something that may work or may not work.
There is, as of today, no incentive for switching to something that is non-existent, right? So this is the good part of the talk today. I can't sell you anything. I could just give you a brief overview about technologies, and we'll see if somebody comes up with something like an MSB. I'm really curious to see that. So I'm kind of interested in the future. Yeah.
So you talk about transaction management. Do you have any direction or solution or tools today that kind of handle that for the microservices?
Okay. Question was transaction management for microservices. Any recommendations? None that came to my mind right here, right now. I'm just briefly looking at my coworker and try to find out if he knows anything about transaction management in the microservices world. You're looking into Camel and covering everything inside the services, right? But cross-service transactions, I have to take it offline. So just grab my card and we'll talk about it. Thanks for your attention. It was my pleasure, and I hope you have a wonderful conference day. Bye-bye.